Longtime listeners know I love digital transformation, partly because I like teasing about it. And so when an expert in the space offered their expertise, I knew I had some questions to learn why do digital transformations fail, but also, is it just consultant speak? Jonathon Hensley joins me on this bonus episode of The Business of Tech. Jonathon, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Dave.
Now, I got to talk digital transformation, and that's what we want to dive in here. And I think I want to start with kind of your take on the headline. Let's start at the end here. Why do so many digital transformation initiatives fail?
Well, I think it's a huge issue of understanding that technology is more people than it is actually the technology itself that you're enabling within an organization. So statistically, you might have anywhere between 70 to up to 91% of digital transformations either fail or underperforming. And most of it is because there's a culture shift that has to come with that technology transformation of the business. And it goes far beyond the business model. It's actually how you deliver your products, your services, your experiences for your customers beyond the operational side of that kind of transformation.
So what's happening? Are the teams of consultants that are coming in to work on this, are they focusing too much on tech and not on people? What should they be doing instead?
Well, I think a lot of the consultants that do come into this space are focused on things like what's the broader opportunity in your industry, what's the business model opportunity for your organization to evolve, where can you find operational efficiency in your organization. There's a lot of emphasis on modernization around automation or consolidation of systems that have traditionally been handled across multiple touch points in an organization or even cross-functionally. And the challenge with that is that it stays very high level. Many consultants don't actually have the background and the expertise in executing on these systems. What does it take to actually inclusively involve, let's say, your entire organization in that transformation process? Is the strategy of the organization and the outcomes of your digital transformation actually aligned to the intended goals you have for your organization, let's say 3 to 5 years from now? How have you actually inclusively brought people into the process to drive adoption and the culture shift that needs to take place? I mean, those are just a few examples that I think are really often missing in that bridge of shifting from the idea of transformation and building that strategy and then actually being able to deliver on it. And maybe most importantly, rarely is outside of the economic side of it is there enough detail to actually codify where is value being created for the individual, whether that be the customer or the employee in that process.
It sounds a little bit like they're not answering the question why of the transformation enough. Am I oversimplifying? What do you think of that?
Well, I think that's definitely part of it. I mean, I think there's a challenge in a lot of industries where it's like everybody's modernizing, so should we, right? There's this industry groupthink that happens, and then you kind of look at the top performing organizations in your industry and you say, well, we should do it like them because they're successful. And you're looking at it from the outside often, or maybe a consultant that says, I have experience with other companies like yours and I have that track record. And that's one facet of things, but the way that your competitors or peers in your industry do things may be completely wrong and actually be quite destructive for your business, candidly. And rarely are best practices cross industry appropriate. What you do in the technology sector is completely different than what you need to be doing in healthcare right now. There's an entirely different framework for decision making and how you drive that transformation effectively, because you have an entirely different ecosystem of stakeholders, systems, dependencies, rules, regulations, policies, employee dynamics that completely change the scope of that conversation. And so I think that building alignment and that through line from the strategic level and all the way through the organization is one, it's incredibly hard to do and it takes a long time. And so that you get a lot of fatigue through the process, and so things get dropped, even with the best of intentions, that a lot of times end up in failure.
It almost sounds like you're recommending that people be deeply vertical if they're going to be doing digital transformation, because you've got to understand all of the nuances of the industries you work in. Am I misreading that? Give me a sense of the balance between general technologist versus vertical specialist.
I think it's a really good distinction to call out. So one would be is, let's say we want to modernize the way that we do inventory management. So there's probably a piece of software out there that maybe is where you're dealing with a legacy process, and there's something that is probably, fairly well established that is accounting for best practices. And so maybe that's part of your transformation journey, is to modernize that so you can have real-time data on where your inventory is, what's happening with that inventory. And that's great. It's filled with transactional knowledge and information about your business. That's where there can be prescriptive solutions within an industry. I think when transformation is often approached, it's also coming from a point of view of, let's innovate our business model, let's drive more substantial change, let's change the way that we offer our services or our products to the market. And when that starts to happen, you have to go beyond these prescriptive systems that come with a huge promise. I mean, the promise of technology to do all these amazing things. You have to start to move into, well, let's really, step back and look at what are all the interdependencies, and will this actually produce the outcome that we want for the people that are involved, not just the business. And so oftentimes I see, leaders really can struggle with this. As an example, like developing an effective strategy that can drive the execution of your transformation can be confused with being aspirational or setting goals or doing planning activities. And none of those things are strategy. So that gap is already basically tying your team's hands behind their back before they've even gotten started. And so you create a tremendous amount of rework, disconnect, and level of effort that costs time and money for the organization, which some organizations at a smaller scale can't recover from. Their ability to invest into these things is finite. So, it's really important that going back to that idea of a through line is there. And so leaders have a responsibility when we talk about, what a great product or transformation vision is for an organization. It has to be explicit. Yes, you want it to be inspirational, but it has to be clear. What does the future look like for our business if we succeed? Is that measurable? What does that look like? And not things like like revenue targets or things like those are lagging indicators. What does it actually look like for the customer? What are the things that have to change around us in order to make that feasible, so that there's a way for everybody involved to make effective decisions?
So I want to throw out a premise, an opinion I've viewed, and I want to get your reaction to it a little bit. So my take on digital transformation is that it's a nice way of telling companies that have fallen behind on their technology investments to catch up. And then instead, you actually, like a well-run business, should actually be constantly, iteratively investing in technology so that you aren't forced to transform your business. What's your take on my opinion there?
I think it's a good opinion, and I think for a lot of businesses it does ring true. I think it comes back to me, from my perspective, to be, organizational culture. Like, what is the actual comfort with change, and is that change actually necessary? Like, when I look at what's happening in the restaurant industry, like, digital transformation is not really a thing there. Like, the way that we cook and the way that we bring an amazing experience to the customer is still very intimate. It's help, technology almost can get in the way of that experience. When you're talking about other industries like banking, they're grossly behind. And because they're risk adverse culturally. It's part of the business model. And you even have organizations where, you've got one side of the business that maybe is very, open to change, but others that aren't. I mean, I've seen a lot of this with, the IT side of an organization, as an example, where you have kind of two camps, one that's driving for that continuous improvement, like you're talking about, but one that's really there and they're playing defense. They have to tackle the risk and making sure that there's continuity of the business. And that becomes a really big challenge to drive innovation simultaneously while trying to reduce risk. And that's a really hard thing to take on. So if you're CEO of the organization or you don't have your entire C-suite really understanding why this transformation is a necessity, you end up having a lot of disconnects in that process, and that organizations are just going to struggle with that.
So there's two things that I want to ask you about. The first is I actually want to ask a little bit more about the example that you were in a way dismissive of. You were dismissive of digital transformation in restaurants. Now, I could make an argument that what we just came through with transformation of the way restaurants are engaging with customers through digital ordering now and through through a different kind of experience, that in fact they had a forced digital transformation. What's your take thinking about that? Was that not digital transformation and something else, or what's your take there?
It's I totally understand your point. I think it's good to call me out on that. I think that it probably for some felt like a transformation, and I do think some new innovations and business models did come out. But the concept of to-go orders or delivery was pre-existing. It was something that is not necessarily drove actual techno innovation within their own organization to drive the innovation itself. They were adopting third-party systems to enable delivery services that had been existed for quite some time. So from that perspective, I don't feel like the fundamentals of the business changed. I feel like how the touch points, the way that they interact with the product and service did change though. And so for me, that doesn't entirely fall into the category of true transformation.
Okay, I think that subtlety of definition actually helps understand the way you're thinking about it. And I appreciate that. So then the second thing I wanted to ask about is a little bit about that IT department reducing risk factor. Because we see that a lot, right? We see that not only in internal IT departments, but oftentimes we'll even see that with external groups, that are delivering a set of services and may in fact become entrenched. We see this in the managed services space. How do you recommend working with an IT group to make sure that they aren't overcompensating on their reduction of risk when a business is either considering or needs to transform?
Well, I think what's really important is to look at all functions of a business, and IT being one of those critical functions, to say, okay, if the strategy for the business and our vision for the business is evolving, then what is now the actual mandate of the IT organization? And I think in some cases it actually does force an IT organization to either retool or redefine their responsibilities in the organization when they're approaching these types of crossroads, because and oftentimes that's not happening. It's like, well, they're providing the systems, there's the technology, expertise, they're, managing systems, but IT, depending on the size of the organization or the service provider, what are they actually building? What are they actually facilitating, from that perspective? And are they focused on, the outputs of what their purview is, or are they really trying to drive the outcomes? And what I see is that the IT organizations, when they shift to an outcome focus and they understand the dependencies that the entire businesses now have on them to drive that process, they're now empowered to start to make a culture shift in how they operate, and they can more divide and conquer and start to pivot. And I think that the leaders in an organization need to make sure that they're having that conversation, whether it be with an outside provider or internally, and say, here's the mandate. We needed you to do this before, but we're changing. Here's how that mandate, here's how IT fits into that, and let's redefine those roles and responsibilities so we can work towards that common goal.
So I think my sort of last question then is how are you recommending to leaders and organizations to help define outcomes correctly to get to success? Like what do they need to know to think ahead toward that outcome and be successful?
Well, I mean, coming from the product and, overall transformation space, the key thing for me is always first and foremost, do you have a really commanding understanding of the problems you're trying to solve with this transformation? And I think what happens oftentimes is we can leap to technology with the assumption of a solution or some sort of promise of change and growth without really understanding or creating a criteria for ourselves of like, is this the right technology and will this really enable the outcome the business needs? So we get kind of tunnel visioned on the technologies that we're evaluating, and we don't look at them and how they interconnect and they play together. So I think that, first and foremost, I really recommend to leaders is like, well, let's understand the full scope of the problem we're trying to solve with this transformation effort. And then from there, we can really start to say, okay, well, what are the outcomes for the business that we want to achieve? What are then the outcomes that would ideally drive the vision for the company for our customers? And then that way we start to have a criteria for the decisions and the solutions we're going to evaluate and pick, that we're only going to pick things and focus on initiatives that are going to drive the business outcome, the customer outcome, and move us simultaneously towards the vision we have for this transformation. And it creates a level of accountability that's missing in a lot of these transformation initiatives and allows us to take this huge potential initiative or thing, and we can then start to break it down into very digestible small chunks, year by year, quarter by quarter, month by month, week by week, even if we need to. And we can then do that with confidence. We can take that approach of saying, okay, well, we're 100% confident on what's in front of us in the next 3 to 6 months. After that, we have to, our confidence level in these things goes down because we haven't done the work yet. And so what you do is you manage to the outcome. And one of the things I love with a system like OKRs, which is objectives and key results, is it's bringing agile thinking to outcomes and to planning. And so you can be iterative. And I think a lot of times that planning is thought of that it needs to be fixed. I need to put a budget to it. It has to have a fixed timeline. And when you're taking on transformation, you need to experiment. You need to be open to adapting and change so you can be resilient, but always working towards that outcome and recognizing that that is what's going to keep your business being successful and driving its impact that you want to have.
Jonathan, I think that's a great place to end. If people need to learn more, how can they get in touch?
If they want to get in touch, I'd recommend visiting emergeinteractive.com or reach out to me on LinkedIn.
Jonathan, thanks for joining me today.
Dave, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for your time and attention. Time is a finite resource, and I really value you giving me some of yours. If you like this video, you can let me know with a like of the video, and even more valuable, hitting the subscription button. My content is all free, and I use metrics like subscriptions to pay the bills, so it has real value. The content here is produced under ethics guidelines posted at businessof.tech. If you're interested in more content like this, you can get access to content early via our Patreon at patreon.com/MSPradio. It's our give what you want model where you set the value of what you think the content is worth. If you like this podcast, you can catch it daily as the 5-minute news and commentary show, The Business of Tech, available on all your favorite podcatchers with links at businessof.tech. Just hit that big blue button to subscribe. Again, thank you for taking time out of your day to listen, and I really value the interaction. If you want to say something in the comments, I do respond and watch all that, and I look forward to talking to you next time.